Hi, my name is Mane. I'm going first. She, her pronouns, and verbal POIs, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eugene. I'm going second in reply, she, her pronouns, and POIs verbally. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Oven, he, him pronouns. I'm going third and verbal POIs as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I get team opposition to do the same?
I'm Tajay. I'll be the first opposition speaker. I use he, him pronouns, and on Singapore, we all prefer verbal POIs. Thank you. Oh, I'll also be doing the reply speech.
Hi everyone, I'm Harith. I'll be delivering the second opposition speech. I also prefer verbal POIs and he, him would be great. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Caleb and I'll be doing the third opposition speech. I prefer he or they. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So before I begin, I have 4 reminders. I'll be keeping time for this debate by texting the Zoom chat at the 1st minute, 7 minute, 8 minute, and 8 minute 15-second mark. I will also type at the end of the speech the total time spoken. Before you speak, please re-indicate how you would like your POIs. Speakers who are not speaking in this round, coaches, team managers, and observers, please be reminded to switch off your camera and mute yourself at all times throughout this debate. If you are a designated speaking member or a member of the judging panel in this round, please switch on your camera throughout the debate. And this is so that we know you are on this call and can attend to you if there are any dropouts. On the motion that this House regrets the westernization of the elites in post-colonial countries, I will hand the floor over to the chair judge for this round. Please take it away. Thank you.
Right, wonderful. Thank you very much, Kate, for those introductions. Just like to welcome everybody once again to the quarterfinal round of this year's WSDC. Indeed, a wonderful feat for both teams making it this far in the tournament, especially at what was an incredibly competitive WSDC. So congratulations, first and foremost, for reaching the quarterfinals. In the panel of the judge, we have 5 wonderful judges to judge you today. My name is Lupi, I'll be the chair. My preferred gender pronouns are he or they. However, we do really appreciate if you could address the panel as a whole collectively. So panel or members of the House would be fantastic. In the order that they appear in Tabby, may I please invite my fellow judges to introduce themselves to the room? I believe that's starting with Claire. Oh, sorry, Anastasia.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anastasia. I'm Croatian, pronouns she, her. Best of luck to both teams and congrats for making it this far.
Kia ora Tefano. My name is Claire Ryan from New Zealand. My pronouns are she or they. Best wishes to everyone in this debate.
Hi everyone, Eric from South Africa, he, they pronouns. All the best and congratulations for making it this far.
I'm Mateusz from Slovenia, judging for Turkey. He, him, they works as well. Good luck to both teams.
Right, wonderful. So those would be the introduction for judges. We'd like to ask that everybody please heed the preferred gender pronouns as indicated when they are indicated. And I believe that all speakers here prefer verbal POIs, so let's stick with that. And I think we're good to go with the round unless anyone has any questions. All right, wonderful. In that case, let's make the quarterfinal a wonderful debate. I have a feeling that this will be a great one. In order to open the motion that stands under their name, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the proposition side of the House to speak for the House. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Very clearly.
All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The westernization of elites leads to the degradation of respect in our own culture and identities, forever entrenching post-colonial states as inferior to our Western counterparts. The setup from proposition is threefold. Firstly, we regret the westernization of elites. We would rather than elites post and during colonialism stay within your own country, keeping their wealth and influence within these countries to build out, for example, local education system and local institutions. Secondly, on opposition, the westernization of elites looks like them traveling to the UK and to other Western states to live, to work, to study, all because they prefer the culture in those areas and because they prefer those societies. Lastly, we say when we're talking about post-colonial states, these are often states that are still rebuilding and they have the active incentive to build a functioning state. We would say Western institutions aren't the only ones that work. We can have institutions that are specifically tailored to these individuals, to those cultures. For example, we still have public education, but instead of 40 students all reading pro-colonialism propaganda in one classroom, it is tailored to the multicultural setting of these countries. Democracy in the United Kingdom, for example, was based on a racially homogenous society versus our kind of society is one that's built on having multiracial identities within the society. Two arguments then to forward from proposition. Firstly, on why it's principally egregious to be compliant in a system of oppression. Secondly, on how this leads to the degradation of development of state institutions. The first argument, the principle, 3 parts here. Number 1, colonialism was an oppressive structure imposed onto every post-colonial state, involving ruthless divide and conquer of our society, pillaging our land of resources, our potential to grow, cultural erasure, and erasing the identities we hold true to our hearts. This is something that's objectively wrong and we should objectively oppose, but the rhetoric on opposition is that these Western ideas are fair, that these institutions are good. They excuse all of the abhorrence when we welcome those institutions as something we should mimic and something we should replicate. In the status quo, it is already extremely difficult for developing nations to get compensation for the horrors of colonialism. Opposition makes it far worse. Secondly, we say elites are a culturally normative force. They hold positions of power, they hold wealth. For example, when they're political or financial leaders within the country, and people automatically associate them with success. Therefore, in opposition, individuals associate these elites with success, with Western culture, with Western languages, with Western religion, like Christianity. On opposition, you idealize everything associated with them, idealizing then these Western ideals. Why is it so principally abhorrent? The third layer of this argument. Because what opposition does is idealize Western cultures at the expense of our own by putting Western culture on a pedestal. We say the purpose of independence post-colonialism is autonomy over your identity and over yourself. But what opposition does is impose this idea that many post-colonial states lose the basis of their culture and the key to self-actualization, the roots to their identity. When you view your mother tongue as unimportant, and when you view, like, for example, speaking Chinese as something that's not going to make you successful, you have internalized feelings of inferiority under your side of the house. This empowers the colonizers' rhetoric that they came to our countries and civilized us by bringing us humanity, devaluing our value as individuals, saying we only have importance because of the West. This argument is independently principled. I should be allowed to feel proud in my mother tongue and my religion, absent of Western imposition, without feeling failing because I am not subscribing to their ideals of what successful is. But before I go on, I'll take that point.
Given that elites tend to overwhelmingly come from one ethnic group, why is it that your likely comparative is one of multiracialism rather than promoting the narratives of the ethnic group the elite come from?
We think that when elites stay within the country, there's a higher probability of them interacting with different racial groups. Under your side of the house, you would be bringing an elitist and a kind of view that doesn't take into consideration any of the suffering of anyone within the country. On a scale, we are far better for people within these countries. The second argument on how this leads to the degradation of the development of state institutions, also in 3 parts. Firstly, we say the Westernization of elites in the past entrenched Western norms for decades. For example, we see our final goal as replicating their system and their system to be the one that is best. After assigning ideas of success with the West for generations, we always feel our system is inferior. This leads to harm and impacts the institutions of states in 2 ways. Firstly, how this harms local education systems in 2 ways as well. Firstly, we say the reason why local education systems in post-colonial states like ours is developed so slowly is because elites leave and they don't come back. They don't build up local institutions because a bad local education system doesn't affect them when they know they're just going to move to Harvard because they perceive that to be a more successful institution. On our side of the house, when they stay within the countries, when they invest their time and money into it, this creates investment into the local education system. If you attend local universities, you will give endowments. Your success as an individual in a position of power, for example, an elite is more likely to be successful, gives credence to the success of the university, which begets even more smarter minds to enter these universities. It is a vicious cycle that elevates the intellect of everyone in society that opposition never gets. Local universities are important to make education accessible to everyone. Opposition exacerbates the wealth gap, for example, when only wealthy individuals can achieve education and can achieve quality education when local institutions are never meaningfully developed under their side of the house. Secondly, they have brain drain on opposition. This looks like post-colonial states are post-conflict. They need the brightest mind and the highest capital in order to develop. These nations have nascent government structures. They don't have wealthy coffers, for example, to kick off innovation and new industries. Therefore, you're relying on your local talent pool in order to develop and grow as a country. On opposition, this never happens because these individuals leave and they don't return because you don't even develop the local institutions. But if opposition wants to say that these elites will come back and they will bring with them ideas that help the country grow, we have two things to say. Firstly, we don't think the West is the only way for you to be able to achieve success and development. But secondly, we say that these individuals are likely not to return. Your wealthy individual will go to, for example, the UK, form connections overseas, have memories and lived experiences there. And after the entrenchment of Western ideals that say that those societies are superior, they're going to stay there, they're going to bring their wealth and influence there, and you will never meaningfully develop your countries. This is why education institutions in countries like ours, like Malaysia, are so underdeveloped because of this idealization of the West. The second part of this argument, the last part of this argument, is about how this impacts the political system. And this directly clashes with your POI on how we get more inclusive systems. We say that your political systems will never fit the people on the ground for three reasons. Firstly, because those in charge of nation building, for example, the elite, don't know the context of the people there. For example, you went to boarding school in the UK, you have no idea the racial tensions in the country. You have no idea that people need, for example, welfare. You just want to bring ideas of like fiscal conservatism from the country that you came from. But secondly, we say the imposition of things like the common law, for example, from the UK, is not fit for locals. The system of land ownership with indigenous individuals versus that of the United Kingdom was vastly different, imposing Christianity over local cultures. These are things that individuals don't want, don't need, and we think that you should not support under their side of the house. But lastly, we would rather have, for example, quotas under our side of the house for different racial groups. We get our own form of government that's representative of everyone because everyone wants to build a country. But for example, the West would never allow this kind of quota system because that's unlikely to be democratic. This means that their systems will never fit the local populations. And when you impose a failing system, this just creates more tension when it is a system that is in contention with the local population and with their moral compasses. When we perceive the West as our only path to survival, we forcefully impose a failing system onto countries who will never get the chance to develop. Change has to be organic, change has to be natural. We don't support the Westernization of elites. Proud to propose.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. First proposition for those very fine remarks. To open the case from the opposition side of the House in this debate, inviting the first speaker from that bench to deliver their speech. Hear.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
I prefer verbal POI. Thank you. The case of team proposition is hinged on the one line in first that they have a multicultural society. If this is not true, then all of their argumentation about the harms of cultural hierarchy, the imposition of one culture upon all minorities, apply to them as well. Notice they give you absolutely no reason why this multicultural society is a likely comparative. And given that this motion is retrospective, they have no fiat to do so. There are few reasons why this is unlikely to be the comparative. First, because the elites in many of these countries are ethnically homogeneous. As a result of colonial divide and rule tactics, where colonizing powers designate one ethnicity to rule in their place after they leave or during the period of colonization, these elites on their side of the house that shape society and shape governance overwhelmingly come from an ethnically dominant and majority class that is not representative of the entire society. For example, the Tutsis in Rwanda were designated by the British colonizers as their vice-regents in that country. They therefore have an incentive to propagate their majority culture on their side of the house, meaning that all of the harms of cultural imposition apply to them as well. They have no case. Who are these elites that we are talking about? Elites, as I mentioned, are traditionally concentrated among one ethnic group. For instance, the Sikhs in Indian civil service or the Indonesian Chinese under Dutch colonization in Indonesia. This means that privilege is largely inherited along racial lines. What is our stance on opposition? We do not regret the Westernization of elites in post-colonial countries. The burden on proposition is not just to show that Westernization is harmful, but that it would have been worse than any other counterfactual. They have to structurally prove why in the absence of this Westernization, their comparative would occur. This debate, importantly, is not about regretting the presence of elites. This debate is specifically about whether they should be westernized or not. On their side, there are still elites. The likely comparative is that they would have imposed in their own racial culture. For instance, the Burmese government, composed largely of Burman elites, imposed the Burmese language and Buddhist religion on the Christian, Karen, and Shan people. We have three arguments on opposition. First, that westernization avoids ethnic conflict. Second, that westernization allows for political dissent. And my second speaker will prove how westernization improves foreign relations. Let's first take a look at proposition's case. They first tell us that colonialism is bad and therefore westernization is bad. First, they tell us that Western ideas are seen as superior to those of your local country. This is not true, because this argument assumes that Western culture is only concentrated among Western people and their descendants in these post-colonial countries. As I'll show you later in my first argument, this is not true, and therefore this idealization does not occur. Second, they say Western ideas inherently propagate colonialism, whereas local ideas don't. This is just untrue. Many of the anti-colonial narratives that led to the downfall of colonialism were propagated in Western societies and Western universities. For example, Ho Chi Minh was educated in Paris and brought those anti-colonial ideas back to Vietnam. Finally, they say there is cultural inferiority on our side of the house. This is going to be the same on their side. When there's cultural inferiority between the minority and majority communities in your country, they have to prove why that is better. No, thank you. Second, they say that the development of local society is hindered on our side of the house. First, they tell us education systems are hindered because Western elites overwhelmingly go overseas. The reasons for brain drain are largely unrelated to this motion. If these elites want to move overseas, I suggest it is likely because they think they can lead a better life overseas, regardless of the kind of culture they have. Moreover, their comparative assumes that there are no poor-rich geographical divides in local countries. The likely comparative on their side is a brain drain from rural areas to urban areas, where these urban cities are overwhelmingly developed with their local universities and rural areas are still left out. So their comparative is not any better. Second, they say, well, brain drain is likely to occur. No, these elites are unlikely to stay in the West precisely because they are elites in your local context. Within your local country, they have overwhelming social and economic influence, which they don't have overseas. If, for instance, no thank you, elites from Nigeria move to the UK, they don't have that kind of overwhelming social influence in the UK, thereby creating an incentive for them to remain in Nigeria. Finally, they say, well, the political system is different. Firstly, because these elites will impose ideas upon the population which they don't like. First of all, these are probably not the people who are going to be voted in, insofar as these people continue to support things that they support rather than these colonial impositions. Second, on their side, it is likely a comparative of private schools and gated communities, meaning that the same harms of being unaware of the local community abound. And finally, this argument is based on the strange premise that non-Western people can never be governed by Western institutions. That's probably not true, given the successful rise of many Asian countries via Western systems, for example, Japan. For these reasons, all of these arguments are out. Moving on to my first argument, on maintaining ethnic equity on our side of the house. The premise of this argument is that on Team Proposition's side, the culture that they propagate must be the culture of the dominant social group. I've already given you an incentive as to why this dominant social group exists and why they want to propagate their own culture. Before I move on, yes.
When elites go overseas and say that they are superior, they have education and they have knowledge that enables them to entrench their racial superiority over others, what is the comparative on your side?
I'll prove to you later in my argument why there is an incentive for these elites to spread English to the rest of society. Listen out for that. On their side of the house, therefore, there is the exact kind of cultural hierarchy that they decry in their argument, especially because it is incredibly difficult to create the kind of syncretic, multicultural narrative that they stand for, particularly given a history of ethnic conflict between these different ethnic groups in many of these societies. The upshot, therefore, is that social opportunities are unequally distributed on their side of the house because members of minority groups find it far harder to access any opportunities. On their side, when you go to school as a minority person, you are confronted by a language that you have no exposure to, which your classmates have been learning since birth. In job markets or in politics, you have to converse in a language or observe customs that you are foreign to compared to your colleagues who have been speaking them since birth. This ossifies a race-based social hierarchy, where members of the majority race are overwhelmingly dominant in politics and society, which is not only unjust by their metric, but also leads to a large amount of discontentment on the part of minority communities. This discontentment could result in a spectrum of responses. On the milder end of the spectrum, it could look like social stereotypes and discrimination, a self-reinforcing cycle, because when minorities are locked out of opportunities, they are perceived as inferior because of their failure to rise to the top of society. On the more extreme end of the spectrum, it could look like outright ethnic conflict, where members of the minority feel that they're so discriminated against, the only way to resolve this issue is to rise up against the society. The comparative on our side is Western culture used by elites. At the very least, accessing these elite rungs of power is now equally easy or difficult to all, because no one has preferential access to English on our side. Moreover, elites do have an incentive to increase access to Western culture for the rest of society. First, in order to increase their economic competitiveness, to ensure that the broad majority of your society, for instance, can work in your civil service or your MNCs. And second, because there's often no way to prevent it due to the globalized spread of Western culture. For all of these reasons, these harms are mitigated on our side of the house. Second argument, enabling critiques of governance. On their side, any critique of your government is seen as a critique of your culture. Without Western culture, governments can couch their governance in traditional values. So, for instance, the national culture of your country. The harm is therefore that this empowers governments to silence critique in two ways. First, because authoritarianism is justified based on twisted interpretations of your national culture. For instance, the Asian values discourse in Southeast Asia in the 1960s, which said that authoritarian political systems are Asian values, and hence these kinds of Western liberal ideas are foreign imports, and democracy is something foreign to our society. This also looks at India, for instance, where criticism of the BJP is couched as criticism of Hinduism and therefore silenced and cracked down upon. Authoritarianism, therefore, abounds on their side. On the comparative, Western culture is not seen as belonging to your nation or your government. Governments cannot use Western culture to shield authoritarianism, not only because it doesn't belong to your society, and therefore you feel no harm in attacking that particular culture, but also because empirically, most Western countries today are strong liberal democracies without these authoritarian tendencies. Therefore, on this grounds, we ensure that authoritarianism is strongly devalued on our side of the house. Because we support racial equality rather than racial hegemony, we are proud to oppose.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much, First Opposition, for those very fine remarks. Continuing the claims from Team Malaysia in this debate, inviting the second speaker from that bench to speak. Here.
Is it okay if I just go to the toilet for a quick second? So sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, can I be heard?
Clear.
Western nations imposed Christianity and Catholicism upon countries that never asked for it to begin with. Regressive values like divorce being illegal in the Philippines and sodomy being illegal in Indonesia. We adopt the moral compasses of our oppressors, we let them tell us that they are better than us, and we integrate them into our institutions. That was the material that side of opposition never wanted to deal with. All they wanted to say it's symmetrical and mitigate against it instead of dealing with the core of our case, where you idealize white identity and oppression under your side of the house, where the elites control the media, where they were looked up to, where the marker of status is going abroad for your education, where you had the lower middle class saving every single cent and bankrupting themselves so that they could send their kids to university in New Zealand and UK. That was what they they were never willing to defend with. And all they said is, oh, it's not a multicultural society, and therefore there'll be a racial hierarchy as well. No, what we're saying is that now you're adopting the identity of your oppressors, and that is entrenching the kind of racial divides that you say exist. I'm going to deal with three main things in this speech. First of all, on this idea about whether there's idealization or not, and about this weird multicultural argument that came out from first opposition. Secondly, I'm going to deal with development, which I felt was woefully underanalyzed and underengaged with. And thirdly, on politics and our institutions. First of all, the main premise coming from opposition is that everything is symmetrical for some reason, because these are multicultural societies in which there's going to be a racial hierarchy, meaning that there's going to be of some culture to begin with. If this is true, the first thing I want to ask is that if one culture is going to be oppressed, why does it have to be the one of our oppressors, ones who actively caused us trauma, took away our rights, and killed our fellow people? Why is that the case? No analysis coming from their side of the house. They then say that actually this is more accessible to individuals. I think it's frankly offensive that they say it's more accessible for people to learn English rather than things like Swahili or Malay. For instance, we think that actually there's more preferential access to English or to other Western languages, because in order for you to access these institutions and to begin with, or to be able to go to institutions of higher education, you needed that capital and you needed to be part of the elite to access that. If they wanted to say that it was so easy to teach everyone in school the same thing, then therefore it would be similar to do that under our side of the house. But note that this is an incredibly cherry-picked context from their side. Their case only applies insofar as there is a racial hierarchy and there's one dominant group. If this is not the case, then their case only applies in a set amount of instances. Compare this to our side, where our case applies to all developing states that are post-colonial, regardless of whether that was the case or not. In fact, we think it's likely to be worse under their side of the house. What we told you in APOI was never actually responded to, even though they told you that they were going to flag it out in their argument. Instead, now these elites are able to entrench their superiority because they're using Western elitism to say that I am better than you. I have gone abroad. I've gone to superior institutions like Harvard and Oxford. I know better than you, and I've accessed all these academia that they say are so good. Therefore, it actually becomes worse under their side of the house. If there's interaction locally, if I'm part or we revert to pre-colonial structures in which we have localized governance, or people being able to interact with each other, we say that it's far worse rather than actually exacerbating this harm to begin with. It is not symmetrical. They never wanted to deal with a scale under their side of the house. I'll take a point now. Yep, no? Okay, moving on. Secondly, let's talk about development. Now, the only responses that we get are incredibly flippant from side of opposition. They say that the reason why they leave is because they would leave under our side of the house as well, because they consider it to be better elsewhere. This does not deal with the nuance of the argument that Nguyen brought out to you from first. First of all, because the only reason why we believe there is a better quality of life coming abroad is because of the fact that we idealize Western states. So if we were able to pour money into our own institutions and develop our economies, then we'll also be able to attain a similar or even better quality of life. This is what we told you. If we make our educational institutions better, if we pour money into them, into their endowments, or if we just stay here as elites in totality, this means that we'll be able to access that very same quality of education. This means that uniquely, this only happens under your side of the house, where you're brainwashed into thinking that I may get a better quality of life in New Zealand, for instance. It's not symmetrical as well. I'll take a point now if there's one.
Why would a local elite move and stay overseas when he is an underclass in a Western country and an elite in his own country?
Look, have you read the motion? This is literally about elites going to other places and going to attain Western educations and institutions. Also, if that is the case, that is simply not the case, and it's empirically untrue. We also see that, for example, in Malaysia and Singapore and tons of countries, you do have these business and politician elites going to British boarding schools and going to migrate to other countries as well. That essentially deals with everything that you're saying. Finally, let's deal with this idea on politics. Note that they have a very funky argument in which they say that you silence critique, and the only rebuttal that they have towards our case is say number one, that elites won't be elected anyway. This is empirically untrue. We think that first of all, the reason why they're able to be elected is because they capitalize on this idea of being better than other individuals, because of the fact that they have gone to these better institutions. That is what we told you from first. Additionally, because of the fact that they are elites, meaning to say that the colonial institutions already entrenched you within that, entrench you within those structures of power, because of the fact of due to things like divide and conquer. That means that you're able to tell them that you're better than them already. But also, what they tell you is just that it's about gated communities. So you would already be segregated from the population. Note that the scale of difference is massive, and they cannot just try to mitigate this. It's about the fact that instead of staying in my own communities or being able to stay in this country, I've gone abroad. I've gone to British boarding school. I'm never able to understand the kinds of struggles that people go through on the ground. This is a huge difference that they never wanted to deal with. They then tell you that you're silencing critique. I would note that, first of all, this uniquely happens under your side of the house, where they're able to entrench the idea that they're necessarily better. If your characterization is that there's tons of multi-ethnic groups in this society, I'm not able to draw upon my own religion to tell them that I am better than you, because of the fact that they are multi-ethnic. So this argument automatically does not stand. We think that actually it's far worse under your side of the house, where they're able to insert install this prejudice when it's exacerbated when wealthy people go abroad, get better education, come back and able to monopolize not only all these opportunities in terms of things like jobs and essentially lock other people out of being able to access institutions, but also just monopolize things like positions of power to begin with. What did they not deal with from our case? Number one, we told you that you're able to sanitize your obligation of colonial powers to people instead of doing things like reparations, apologies, and cultural objects and repatriating them to societies. You just give Commonwealth scholarships and they say, look, I've already benefited you. And because the elites necessarily buy into this, and they tell you this as well through media, through the political institutions, that is something that is necessarily perpetuated. They never wanted to deal with our principled argumentation about given that these are our oppressors, we should not kowtow to them and subjugate ourselves and be stuck in a perpetual cycle of racial self-hate because we believe that they are better than us. Second of all, but before that, I'll take another point.
You tell us that only a small minority of countries have racial diversity and racial hierarchies. Given that many colonialists wanted divide and rule tactics, why is this not the majority scenario in this debate?
Look, first of all, the point of pointing that out was to suggest that your case is highly circumstantial, meaning to say that it only operates within these contexts. If you do not want to deal with all the other cases, you necessarily lose the debate. Second of all, given that this is the case, I've already told you why you exacerbate all of these things. If it was true that they were going to draw upon their own culture simply to tell people, look, I am part of this culture and therefore we should follow all these rules, it is highly unlikely that they would suffer harms to the same extent as to when you have Christianity and Catholicism that are entrenching these power structures and people can draw upon them to say that I am better than you and to implement all of these things. What else did they not deal with? Second of all, we told you about how they impose moral compasses onto you, whether this be, for example, through instituting common law and British law, which is, by the way, in the info slide, so they literally have to deal with it, how they infiltrate civil service societies to impose values onto you that you never wanted to deal with. Third of all, they only wanted to focus on outliers, meaning to say that they did not want to deal with how textbooks are telling you that colonialism is okay, that it was okay that you were being oppressed. Instead, they only focus on the small minority of foreigners who resist the West in the West, like Ho Chi Minh. Look, panel, this is clearly not the majority of cases, and in fact, in the majority of cases, in fact, they are telling you that this oppression was legitimate. They say that it is beneficial to teach all children English. I am not sure why this is the case. They want to sacrifice us being able to connect with our culture for the expense of the oppressors. Finally, at the end of this debate, what was he recognized? That under their side of the house, they uniquely idealize Western culture. It is not true when they tell you that it is symmetrical, because they in fact entrench the power of the elites that they say are so bad. If they cared about the people, they would care about them being able to access their culture. Second of all, they never wanted to deal with development. And thirdly, they never want to deal with politics, in which it becomes worse because I am not able to access the same values as my people, and I've gone abroad and I tell them that I'm better than them. For all those reasons, we're so incredibly proud to propose.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much, second proposition, for those very fine remarks. Continuing the case from the opposition in this debate, inviting the second opposition to speak. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me and see me?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Every time you listen to the proposition team giving you rhetoric about how oppressive Westernization is, I want you to remember their comparative is minorities who have oppressed these ethnic minorities for millennia are able to impose their cultures and their values on the rest of society. Two questions. First, why do they, if their comparative is one, where elites coming from homogeneous ethnic backgrounds impose their cultures? Second, even if this isn't their comparative, why do they still lose? First, why do they lose if this is their comparative? I want to take out two red herrings at the top of this. First, I want to take out their claims about the elites going overseas and not coming back. This underpins all of their argumentation on brain drain. First, we told you why they have no incentive to go overseas, because they are already very influential in their home countries. We heard no direct response to this claim. The second speaker said they would respond, they never did. Second, honestly, I think they can probably maintain a comfortable standard of living in their local country as well, given that they can do things like have gated communities, given that they can live isolated from the types of slums and poverty that everyone else lives in. Third, It's worse to live overseas because people overseas are incredibly racist to you. If you're Nigerian and you go to the United Kingdom, I suspect you would have a lot of racist backlash towards you, making your life very uncomfortable because of rising xenophobia and people believing that you are tribal and primitive. That's why they will come back after going overseas. That's that dealt with. The next claim they try to retreat to is a claim about how elites will not know anything about the national context because they've gone to Oxford and therefore they're not going to know about what's happening on the ground. Again, this is very uncomparative. Given that these people are often immensely wealthy and influential, they will probably live in gated communities and they will not know about the struggles of the ordinary man as they want to tell us. They say the scale is different. I'm not clear why the scale is different. I think it's quite similar if you don't even see these people or interact with them on a daily basis, given that you live such structurally different lives. So again, that's that claim dealt with. Now let's be clear about the heart of this debate, which is what their comparative is. Their comparative is one where the dominant elite impose their cultures on the rest of society. Just like in Burma, where ethnic Rohingya were made to speak Burmese in school by majorities. We told you this was because elites were ethnically homogeneous. We gave you two reasons. First, because of divide and rule and how historically this has meant colonizers prefer one type of ethnic group over the other. I'm going to give you another reason now. Often when governments exit these colonial countries, they want to ensure stability. That's what the British wanted when they exited all of these colonial countries. Here's the problem. In order to get stability, you cannot give power to different ethnic groups because this leads to a lot of conflict. Therefore, you only give power to one ethnic group. Again, meaning that elites often tend to come from the same ethnic group. CF, for instance, how political elites in Malaysia largely come from the dominant Malays. Now, the only response we get is an assertion. They say, we are running a very small case because most post-colonial states are not multicultural. One, this is false. The reason most post-colonial states are multicultural is because when you exit a colonial country, often colonials tend to blend, for instance, the kind of borders that previously existed. They tend to do away with these borders, just like they did, for instance, with the Indian partition initially. They tend to draw borders arbitrarily if they do, which means that often there is a lot of multiculturalism. So this is why structurally most of these states are multicultural. Second, they actually conceded to this in first. When they set up, they conceded that by and large they would support a multicultural identity. What I've proven thus far is that this multicultural identity is structurally impossible and does not apply in the majority of cases. Why then is this homogeneous identity from the elite worse on their side of the house? No. Here's why they said that all the harms we gave were symmetrical. No, we gave you two unique harms that applied to them. Number one, accessibility. The culture of the elite, for instance, the language of the Burmese, is significantly more inaccessible to an ethnic Rohingya than English for two reasons. First, in terms of the amount of resources, there's significantly more resources available to do things like learn English because you have hyper-globalization, meaning you can watch English shows. You often have far more articles in English on the internet, meaning it's far easier for you to learn these types of things. No response. But second response, let's be very charitable. Let's say it's true that it's very difficult to learn English. Do you know why we still prefer this? The reason is because English is something that is equitable. It is equally inaccessible to everyone. Under outside of the house, the thing is no one is explicitly privileged because this is something that is hard for everyone. It means at the very least, we have a principle of equity. On their side, this is one of rampant inequality, where if they teach Malay, you know who is privileged? It is the Malays in school because they've been speaking it their whole life. They create a system of inequality when you are a Chinese boy in school and you don't know how to do the exam paper, but your Malay friend can because it's written in Malay and that's the language he's spoken his whole life. On their side of the house, they create rampant inequality. So even if English is inaccessible, at the very least, we create far more equality than them. This is important because lack of equality in these contexts leads to massive social backlash, which brings me on to my second question, or rather my second part of this, the harm of resentment. On their side of the house, people are going to feel resentful because minorities feel like, at the very least, under our side of the house, everyone has lost their culture. Everyone has benefited or has been harmed by Westernization. Versus on their side of these groups, we got no response, especially because this is very harmful. Here's where I'm going to clash directly with their principle. Where is more resentment caused? Is it caused when you adopt the colonial culture or the culture of the majority? I'm going to break that principle here by proving why more resentment is caused on their side of the house. The reason is because majorities were also oppressive to minorities. So look at the difference. The difference is that on their side of the house, they allow the oppressors, which were the majority who have oppressed these minorities for millennia, to benefit off of this system. Under our side of the house, even if minorities are still oppressed, at the very least, we don't allow majorities to benefit off this principle of oppression. So that's why on this clash, they lose. No. I'm now going to move on to the second clash. Or no, broader, even if this is not like narrative and they stand for multiculturalism, no, I'll explain why they still lose. Here's why. Because thus far, the only thing they've given us here is they say importing Western ideas is just very, very bad. That's all they've been telling us thus far. Number one, They've not given us a lot of analysis for this. Why is it that these Western ideas are necessarily bad? No, thank you. But oftentimes they tend to look like things like democracy. But second, this is outweighed by our second argument, which we heard no response to. Our second argument told you that even if that comparative is a multicultural national identity, these identities are very difficult to criticize because often when you criticize the government, then you are castigated as a traitor. You are castigated as someone who's criticizing the new national narrative that was created, which means often on their side of the house, governments become very autocratic when you cannot criticize them. Comparatively, on our side of the house, you can criticize these governments. Why does this outweigh their argument on or the harms they want to tell you, for instance, specifically about common law? Because you see, right, under our side of the house, when we have more democracy, this means that people can shape the types of policies that exist. So if these policies are very harmful, they can vote them out, relative to their side of the house, when you have no ability to do this. I'm now going to move on to my argument on improving foreign relations. No. The premise of this argument is that Westernization often occurs across regions. For instance, look at how the United Kingdom colonized entire regions of Africa and Southeast Asia. We argue that this means there are two unique harms to their side of the house in terms of foreign relations. I'll take you in a moment. First, this means they often bridge historical enmity because both countries tend to share similar local cultures in our world. On our side of the house, countries like Vietnam and Cambodia that have been historically feuding share a similar culture because they were colonized by the same country. Versus their side of the house, where they resort to the prior national identities that existed that reinforce past fault lines. Before I go on, I'll take the point.
If it was a system of divide and conquer, then Malays or majority groups would have already learned English. If they have more money, they can obviously still get more Westernized education. How are you saying that Westernization is not gatekept?
No, but the point is that on our side of the house, first, I've given you reasons for why it's more accessible. And secondly, and more importantly, many of these Western cultures often have an incentive to, Western colonizers have an incentive to spread English as a language, because when they came in, that was the explicit purpose they said they were coming in for. Back to the argument. This is important because it means that these local countries, which in the past might have feuded, can now reunify, or rather at the very least, not be at loggerheads with one another, compared to their side of the house, where this is what they resort to. Second, language barriers are broken under our side of the house. Countries are far more willing to trade when they have things in common. They're far more willing to engage in economic blocks when they're no longer at loggerheads, when they actually believe in the same sorts of cultures and same sorts of values. Why is this very important? Because it means that under our side of the house, we help post-colonial states. Because in our world, what uniquely happens is that post-colonial states can trade in blocks, meaning they can fight against massive powers of, for instance, Western states that are significantly more powerful than them. It means they can trade within themselves, which allows for far faster development and far faster industrialization, just like we saw in Southeast Asia. This means under our side of the house, we develop post-colonial states significantly faster than them. For all of these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to stand with the opposition.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much. Second opposition for those very fine remarks, and just would like to note that there were slight lapses in terms of audibility, but upon further inspection, the sentences were contiguous. So I believe that none of the points that you conveyed have been compromised due to those lapses in audibility. So overall, very great speech. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. As a final substantive push from the proposition side of the House, I would like to invite the third proposition to speak. Here.
Hi, can you hear me clear? Okay, great. I'm setting up my timer. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, notice that the path to independence required multiracial cooperation, where everyone collectively agreed that we're under colonial rule and we needed them to be ousted from the country in order for us to rebuild collectively and to have harmony. That is why the idea that there is racial hierarchies that exist is not as important from their side, because individuals within this country prioritize rebuilding the state and recognize that there is a higher priority at hand. The comparative that they were unwilling to engage with some side of proposition was, where are you going to empower individuals to weaponize their racial opportunities that were arbitrarily given to them? That is why I'll move on into my substantive issues, and I'll point out a lot of the things that went wrong from the side of opposition. Number one, on the idea of ethnic equity, they say, number one, that a racial hierarchy exists. We question them and say, where is it empowered? Because post-colonial states despise the unfair distribution of resources and opportunities based on arbitrary racial lines. This is when individuals are the most aware and are most heightened about the oppressive structures that could be enacted onto them, given that we've just got independence. The difference is that on their side, the elites that they characterize as racially homogenous, that have all of these social levers in order to impose onto individuals, are now going to be attending Western institutions, are going to be adopting Western stances. And if and when they come back, they're going to be instituting it. But the difference is they have the legitimacy and the superiority that individuals on the ground cannot challenge. They say that I studied at Oxford, I went to the US, I understand the nuances of how to rebuild a country and how to rebuild it best to be the greatest empire that this country could possibly be. That is why when they talk to you about how it's hard to criticize, we think exactly because individuals recognize the oppression, even if there is a majority culture or a majority race, we can hold them to a high standard. Where you can't hold them to a high standard, it's on the side of opposition, where they can weaponize the Westernism that they've co-opted to say that they are the most civilized individuals and they are the ones that have power. This is why the false dichotomies on the side of opposition was disingenuous to this debate, to say that they don't have the same problems they push onto us because now they're not going to be a majority culture, they're going to be a Western culture. We think they convoluted this idea to get away with the arguments that were just flippantly untrue, because it's not about whether it's Western culture or a majority culture, it's whether or not the majority of the races are going to weaponize that Western culture for themselves. Because the point to which you still come back to the state, for example, and you're going to be instituting certain ideologies and instituting states, things like educational reforms or setting up parliament, you're still under the lens of that racial group that you're from. You're still going to be making policies of this, but now you have the legitimacy of Westernism. So it's not true that you're just going to be imposing some broad blanket that encompasses everyone. We never had the burden to solve racial equity. We told you on our side that we made it and we didn't make it far worse. Their side does not have a path to change. They needed to crucially respond to this, and 2 speakers down, they have not done anything of this sort. Secondly, they say that, oh, there are 2 unique harms inside of proposition because we don't create accessibility, and even if it's hard, the English language is equitable. Number 1, notice how where is it harder for individuals and where is it equitable? Because if it's true that these are individuals that are elites that have been segregated by society, these are the people that were in the higher ups that did go to English-based schools in the time of colonialism. So who are you giving advantages to the most when you're going to be instituting Western-based education models? Not the individuals on the ground who are in their rural areas, who were oppressed. It is the racial elite. It is the elite of individuals that were given privileges arbitrarily through drawn lines by oppressive states. That is exactly why their side is perpetuating the inequality. And notice how it's just untrue that, oh, the majority race, therefore there's inequitability. Notice how a lot of states, even if they're multiracial in their context, have a unified national language. For example, within Malaysia, even if it is the majority race is Malay, the national language is the Malay language, which means even Chinese and Indian individuals propagate and practice this language prior to colonization. It is untrue for them to just say, if you're Chinese, therefore you don't learn Malay. They need to understand how a country actually functions. Lastly, on this really flippant and like absurd idea that I can't believe existed in this debate, which is the idea that diminishing language barriers enables economic blocks, and some idea of having the English language allows you to fight your oppressors. Panel, do we literally build trade blocks because we all speak English, or is it just an economically salient policy? I think it's the latter. Individuals in post-colonized states all suffered plunder and therefore work together. You don't need to speak the same language, panel, in order for you to have the benefits. They're saying don't buy the material from opposition just because it sounds flashy. But lastly, props racial equity is tantamount to cultural erasure, because their idea of trying to solve these ideas is to make everyone Western, to force these kinds of impositions onto you. They haven't dealt with the harms in which we told you it was not beneficial, especially within, for example, in the context of the Philippines. We imposed Christianity onto individuals and made the society conservative. We embodied these values in our constitution and in our laws. We've literally made divorce, for example, illegal within these states because the West deemed it to be so, and we've embodied Catholicism within our states. That is why they didn't get their first argument. Ethnic equity is far worse on your side when you're able to use legitimacy of Westernism to impose your racial ambiguity and superiority. But call out was far harder, because what are you going to do against someone that says, I am educated, when you are not? Their second argument on how you're going to be enabling better systems to occur does not stand, therefore, because of this as well. Before we move on, is there a point?
Why aren't elites likely to say that? Because they are richer and have significantly more social advantage. They are therefore also just better to rule on your side of the house.
We think that first it's a skill, but secondly, because after post-colonization, individuals need to work together. If you're only going to be basing it on racial lines, even if you're the majority, if the collective minority don't align with you and you want to institute racially biased policies, you're never going to win. The difference was this idea of education and Westernism transcended racial boundaries. It wasn't that I'm racist or I want to prioritize the Malay race. It's that I'm more educated than you through Westernism and through these kinds of policies existing. But notice how they haven't dealt with any of the argumentation coming out from the bench of proposition, which loses them the debate. Number one, on the principle, which here no response even from the first speaker. The idea that we had independence, and this is the most crucial issue because colonized states share this embodiment.
VAT here, hello. Please stop the clock on adjudicator is disconnected.
I'm already back. So
okay. It's okay.
My timer stopped at 6:45. If that's about right.
That's exactly where my timer stops as well. So I believe that whenever you're ready, just give us a countdown, and then the volunteer will also resume their timer exactly at that point.
Yeah, okay. Restarting in 3, 2, 1. So therefore, what have I proven? Number one, that racial unity that they say is exacerbated and does not exist on their side when you can weaponize these kinds of narratives. And secondly, on their weird idea of enabling critique, we've told you how it's also far worse. Therefore, they have nothing to stand on and Team Singapore cannot win this debate. What have we crucially told you on our side? However, number one, that all in the context of all colonial states, all of these states are ones that wanted independence and free rule from colonizers. But side of opposition is entrenching this because these are states that fought to be different, that fought to, in order to have the laws that they wanted, to institute the kinds of state institutions that they wanted and the majority of individuals on the ground wanted as well. The elites, by westernizing, are entrenching all colonial rhetoric, just absent of the British rule. So it's under the guise and under this that it's extremely hidden, and you're going to be forcing these states under the same rule that they've tried and fought their oppressors for decades. Principally, we can never stand for this when you're going to be erasing individuals' cultures and forcing these kinds of institutions onto you. Secondly, we told you how you made state institutions worse. Here's where they never engaged with brain drain. We told you because of the initial westernization and the idealization of this, it's carried on to modern society, where we view educational institutions of the West to be far superior, where individuals leave and move out of the country in the present in order to get a better life and assume that the Western idea and the Western way of life is superior. That is why you make the diminishing identity of individuals in this country worse. Unity was worse on your side. Team Singapore absolutely has nothing. Side with prop.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much, third proposition, for those very fine remarks and specifically on the elegance on navigating that technical difficulty. So indeed, thank you for the smoothness when it comes to navigating that. And in saying that, we'd like to proceed to the last substantive speaker for this debate and the opposition side of the House, the third opposition. Whenever you're ready, you're here.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
The main problem with their side is that they cannot decide their comparative by fiat. They say in first speaker, they have a system of quotas, that schools teach a multicultural syllabus. If that were true, perhaps they might win. But they cannot simply say that that is the comparative on their side. This is a retrospective debate. If elites did not westernize, what would the world have looked like? If they believed that the Burmese government would have actually allowed the Karens and the Shan to practice their own religion, to have their own language, to have their own schools, then perhaps you can buy their case. But absent of that, you cannot. Therefore, given that the syllabus and the culture on their side is not going to be multicultural, it is very likely that a large portion of their case collapses because they simply have colonialism by other means, where it's your neighbor rather than a country far away that is colonizing you. They have not proven why this was any better. I'm going to look at 3 areas in this speech. Firstly, on the culture and principle, which to be fair is the bulk of their case. Secondly, on which side reduces conflict. And finally, on which side increases development. Firstly, let's talk about culture and principle. This is essentially what they default to in third speaker. They say we should not accept colonialism because this is a thing which is extremely abhorrent. We probably agree, colonialism is bad, but this does not mean that we should erase everything that colonialism has brought. For instance, Western ideals of democracy was precisely what was used to criticize colonialism, and therefore I don't think this necessarily means an erasure of the pre-existing culture. Simply because you choose to accept some motifs of Western thinking does not mean that you become completely Westernized. So for instance, although 40% of Filipino Chinese might speak English, many of them are still Buddhist and celebrate Chinese festivals. So I don't think that this is something that wins them this debate overall. Moreover, they have this small line about reparations, but given that they have not proven why it's likely that you can extract those reparations on their side, they cannot claim this as a substantial benefit. So many of the one-liners that they give us fall out of this debate. Moreover, they tell us there's the idea of a moral compass that is imposed by colonialism. For instance, the idea of sodomy and divorce laws. I'm sorry, but those things occur during the colonial period, not during the post-colonial period. So given this, many Filipinos are already Catholic at the point of decolonization, and thus it's very likely that it will still impose those laws regardless of whether or not they were more Westernized in culture. Therefore, this is something that's probably symmetrical and does not win them the debate in terms of ethical systems. But where I want to make the sharpest attack is the idea of their comparative, because on their side, they have colonialism as well, but simply through other means. Culture is still taken away when it's the majority culture that gets to decide whether or not you go to school and learn a specific language that you want, or whether or not you get to read certain magazines or books because you can simply ban those things. So if they want to hang their case on the idea of kowtowing to your oppressor, I think this is a Pyrrhic victory on their side. On their side, the minorities in Burma have to choose between Burmese erasure and British erasure, and they have not shown why the first or the second is preferable. But in fact, our side actually told you explicitly in Second Speaker that it's worse to have this imposed by a majority culture in your country. This is because the minority elite benefits when that occurs, and we think that is a bad thing that happens. This is not something you responded to in the previous speech. I think it's a concession that perhaps our side is better in terms, even on the case of their principle. But moreover, their principle is also hinged on the idea that it is inequitable, that only some people speak English. So if we're able to prove to you that there are incentives to diffuse this culture throughout the entire population, we win. But we've already shown you this since first, when we told you that some people oftentimes want more people to speak the same language so they can work in their company, so they can staff in their civil service. Therefore, the elite has the incentive to diffuse those language and norms, which means that on our side of the house, it is very likely that the entire population will have access to this rather than simply a small sliver. What I've therefore proven in this first clash is that their principle is out of this realm. And in fact, there are huge incentives for this diffusion to occur. This then leads me on to my second clash on reducing conflict. On our side, we reduce conflict, no thank you, in areas where this debate is most important. They say it's highly circumstantial that there's racial diversity and hierarchy, but it's simply untrue because the way that borders were badly drawn because of divide and rule tactics employed by colonizers, which we told you in first and second, in which they had no response. So we accept this is the majority burden, and their side has to defend that majority. In this comparative no thank you, the homogeneous elite group is likely to seek everyone else to assimilate. There are a few reasons why there's a homogeneous elite group. Firstly, because of divide and rule, and because colonizers wanted to establish a permanent elite they could work with. And secondly, because when colonizers left, they give it to a specific group to ensure a degree of stability. What this therefore means is that there is one elite group that is able to push their culture onto everyone else. That only response, and this came late in third speaker, is the idea that a path to independence requires racial harmony. This is in fact untrue. First of all, racial homogeneity in the army tended to be a good thing. So for example, in India, it mostly tended to be people of the Hindi race. But moreover, many colonial powers actually wanted to lead. So therefore, there was no need for this racial harmony to be engendered. For example, in Philippines, where it was foisted upon them rather than something that was actively fought for. Therefore, a homogeneous culture is imposed on their side of the house. What does this mean? This means that on their side, they have this homogeneous culture that belongs to an indigenous group rather than something imposed by the West. This in fact has huge differences on the way in which people live. In Malaysia, where you impose Bahasa as the national language, the Malay and the Chinese boy go to school and the Malay boy already has the head start. Thus, I can say Malay might be easier to learn, but this is cold comfort towards the Chinese boy who sees that his classmate is already so far ahead of him at a point at which they reach the age of 7. But on our side at least, it is a language that both cannot speak, a language that perhaps they can use to learn together, to build a new history rather than base themselves on those divides. English, a language that you can probably learn far easier due to globalization. Well, compare yourself to living in a Karen city, Burma, where it's very unlikely that you get that exposure to Burmese at the end of the day. So what we've proven in this clash is that we greatly reduce racial conflict. Perhaps there might be still a 1% who speaks English better than everyone else, but we think that having a 1% versus 99% divide versus a 50-50 divide between races is something that is at least preferable. At the end of the day, we get that far better racial preferences. Before I move on to my final clash, I'll take your point.
Why are these individuals who care so much about racial lines on our side after Westernization still not going to be imposing the same kinds of things? How does teaching English to an entire population mean that they're not going to divide and conquer as well on your side?
Because the fact that they want Westernization means that they want people in their company who are able to do their job, who are able to speak English. Therefore, they have an incentive to educate people across the board. So I think that there's in fact less of those ties of kinship and patronage on our side of the house compared to on your side, when this is how you get money, when this is how the way your system works. And that is the only way that you have been able to move up the social ladder. Moreover, Desa had a very flippant response to my second speaker's argument. He told you that there's actually more conflict on their side of the house at a point at which countries against each other fight because of animosities. They cannot simply reduce this to language, but it's also about animosities, for instance, between Vietnam and Cambodia, which they cannot simply ignore. Finally, let's talk about development. On their side, they shout a lot about brain drain. In fact, we've already given you many reasons why the elite will remain in the country, given that they're an elite rather than being a small fish in another country. So elites tend to be in those countries permanently, and this is probably not something that wins them the debate. But here they hang their idea on about fitting things to the local context. We agree that this happens, but they have not shown us why structurally it is likely that they'll fit into the local context in a way which benefits the local people. Common law, in fact, might be a very good thing in many countries where there isn't this idea of property yet. But I suspect that when you mean fitting to a local context, they mean what my first speaker already told you, that a state is able to impose authoritarian structures at a point at which criticizing that is seen as blasphemy. On their side of the house, it's far more difficult to criticize a particular structure when it's seen as epitomizing what your country stands for, rather than if it's a westernized system that is seen that can be critiqued. For these reasons, we believe that it's our side that ensures racial equity and protection. We are proud to oppose.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Third opposition for those very fine remarks. That marks the end of the substantive health debate. Proceeding swiftly to the reply sessions, we'd like to invite opposition reply to start first. Here.
Can everyone?
Yeah, clear.
This debate is about accessing the rungs of the elite. On our side, maybe it is true that majority members who are economic elites have it easier. For instance, the economically wealthy Malay person in Malaysia. The key difference is that the poorer Malay person does not have it easier because he does not speak English on our side. And therefore, when he goes to class and he meets a Chinese friend, neither of them have it easier. On their side, that Malay person is structurally advantaged in all areas of society because society uses a language he was taught at birth and no one else was. Proposition has never grasped that this is the comparative in this debate, and on that ground, they lose. In fact, we did prove that there was an incentive to diffuse Western culture and language to the rest of society from our first speaker. We showed there were economic incentives to do so in order to increase your economic competitiveness, to bring in MNCs, and to staff your civil service. We also showed that there were social incentives to do so because the precise cultural hierarchy they talk about is enabled when you allow for the diffusion of Western culture on our side. All of these were responses that we gave you down the table. It is too late for them to respond in reply. This is strategically important because the only attack that they had on our case is that English is inaccessible. I have proven that English is accessible and their attacks fall. What does their world look like? Their world must be one in which the majority culture abounds. We hear a very late response in the third speaker as to why this is not true. He claims a cultural alliance is necessary to end colonialism. Therefore, there is multiculturalism on their side. My third speaker already proved why this is not true, but we also preempted this because even if this is true at the point of decolonization, a lot of these cultural alliances fail immediately after because these elites see no reason to work together after the colonial enemy has been defeated. Therefore, their world is one of cultural dominance and hegemony. There are a few harms of this. First, they harm democracy. We gave you this argument in our first speech and they largely did not respond. We showed when your governance is tied to your national culture rather than the universal culture of Westernization, as on our side, it becomes increasingly difficult to criticize those policies because criticism of your government is seen as criticism of your race or of your religion or of your culture. We gave you examples like India, for instance, where criticism of the BJP government is cast as criticism of Hinduism and therefore easily shut down. This strategically outweighs their argument on bad Western policies. Even if it is true that elites on our side impose policies that are not tailored to their societies, it is easier to change those policies on our side of the house when you have a stronger, more functioning democracy that can get rid of those particular policies. On their side, you have authoritarian rule that guarantees that these policies can never be rooted out. Second, their side is one of regional conflict. This was the argument our second speaker gave you, to no response from them. The pre-colonial era was not some idyllic time of universal peace. Many of these pre-colonial cultures have long histories of conflict with one another, and when you force them to default to those identities, these conflicts will re-emerge. Finally, proposition collapses to their principle. They say it is wrong to impose the colonial culture. We say it is no better to impose the culture of people who have been oppressing you for millennia before colonialism, like the Burmans to the Karens in Myanmar, for instance. So that principle is not something they can default to in the reply speaker. What about our side? The key attack they make on our side is the argument of brain drain. We showed, contrary to the accusation from their third speaker, there are structural reasons for this brain drain not to occur, precisely because these post-colonial elites are viewed as underclasses of society in the Western countries that proposition claims they will move to, and therefore there's a structural incentive not for them to move. Second, even if this argument on brain drain is true, they haven't shown why their comparative is any better. Presumably their world is also one of brain drain from rural areas to rich urban centers, which is not any better. Second, we have also shown why Western culture is likely to diffuse on our side of the house, which answers the key challenge of the proposition team. It is too late for them to come back to this point in reply speaker since we gave it in first. Hence, all of the accusations that proposition gives to us as to why English is inequitable are out, because we have proven that it is an equitable system of governance. For all of these reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the opposition reply, for those very fine remarks. And finally, to summarize their case, well, as to close the debate, inviting the proposition reply to speak. Here.
Panel, I don't know at what point this debate became about learning English, when it was clearly about when it was about imposing moral superiority over individuals and having cultural erasure. Instead of opposition could not win this debate because they were not charitable. They did not want to make trade-offs. They did not want to engage in a reasonable context. And they took an extremely high burden upon themselves to solve racial unity and stop entrenchment of elites, even though, given that they characterized this debate taking place in a context where there are structural inequalities, where there is malicious intentions and a desire to preserve power, it was clear that neither side in the debate could solve this. Therefore, them hinging their case on everyone learning English, note that their case at the end of this debate was simply distilled towards, oh, at least we're all bad at English and we can all be inferior to our colonial masters together, simply could not win this debate. I think they were incredibly uncharitable, because all they say is that we argued that it is symmetrical. Well, first of all, yes, it was symmetrical, because first of all, why didn't these majority groups have an incentive to spread their language? We considered it offensive that they believed that Chinese and Indian individuals could not learn Malay, but also we argued that it was worse under their side of the house, a context they never wanted to deal with. Because first of all, if it was true that there was divide and conquer, note that this was asked to a POI and to second speaker, and there was no sufficient response, then therefore there would be even more barriers towards learning English in the first place, because these racial groups would have monopolized this language to begin with. Even though it is true in theory that I can go on the internet and learn English, it is worse when there are rich individuals in class who already know how to speak English, who can access uniquely Western institutions abroad like Oxford and Cambridge, and then come back and claim superiority over you. So even though they wanted to say that all we did was make this a wash, no, we said it was worse under their side of the house. But even if they took this marginally, they could not win this debate on these grounds for a few reasons. Number one, this only operates in such context where it truly is so divide and conquer, where there is one majority group that monopolizes all of them. And the only example that they want to give us is Burma and Malaysia. We're talking about a WSDC context. They could not win this on specific instances alone. That is something that we pushed to them from first. This is highly circumstantial. We told you in third, we just escaped oppression. This required multi-ethnic efforts. Why couldn't we have coalitions in which individuals were multi-ethnic and we were able to actually solve these issues? But also, this could not be weighed up against the complete lack of engagement to our arguments about literally eroding local values and cultures. No pushback on this from any speakers until a very limited response in wit. And we told you, and all they said was just, oh, but democracy is good. No, that was not the burden that you had to defend. We told you about things like Christianity, about telling individuals that they were less worthy, about perpetuating a racial cycle of hatred towards individuals. And this is the nuance, right? Because they tried to wash out our principle by just saying that it was symmetrical because majority groups would monopolize it anyway. No, this is not a specific context. You're a country where has had hundreds of years of a past of feeling inferior towards a specific racial group. You idealize white identities under your side of the house. You make it so that your assailants will literally destroy your democracy and incited all racial conflict, will make you feel incredibly like hateful towards yourself, those are the individuals that you are enshrining, and they never wanted to deal with that trade-off that automatically lost in debate. I want to note a contradiction in with and the only point where they wanted to engage with this. They say, well, a cultural erasure isn't happening to such a great extent, but do you want your argument about everyone learning English and everyone being homogenous or not, or do you want to actually defend cultural erasure that necessarily happens under your side of the house? I think this is damning for their case, that they never wanted to engage with the trade-off. This is a trade-off that we're not willing to take. What else did they not engage with? Secondly, how this infiltrates your institutions like common law and imposes values upon people that they never wanted to consent to. This necessarily leads to more racial incitement and people not willing to engage in the institutions in the first place. They didn't want to deal with development. And the only response we get is, well, if we leave, then it will be bad over there. But the point of the motion is saying, regardless of how you'll be treated in other nations, you always believe as the elite that it's better to go to these universities, it is better to leave these countries, and brain drain obviously materializes, and this is empirically true, panel. Don't let them lie to you. Finally, they did not want to deal with reparations. Note that even if the majority group is able to monopolize power, and this is not true because obviously you can criticize people, and given that their context is a multicultural one in which people don't hold the same religions, for instance, that means that I will not be brainwashed into thinking Hinduism is better than my religion, etc. They do not want to deal with this context in which now you allow your colonizers to get away. They're never going to give you cultural reparations. They're never going to say sorry. And for these post-colonial states, this is the most important thing. Development, being able to finally gain ownership over your own identity. And for those reasons, we're so incredibly proud to propose.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much for the wonderful remarks from Proposition Reply. That marks the end of the quarterfinals round. Once again, thank you for what was truly a wonderful debate on that topic. Inviting the teams to virtually cross-floor shake hands as much as Zoom allows. And judges, please join me in room 1, and that will be the breakout room, and we will deliberate there. We'll be back as soon as possible with the results. Thank you once again.
So much.
Thank you very much, Team
Singapore.
Malaysia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.